in this video, I wanted to highlight and explore encoding profiles. This is going to be a central theme and topic, a central pillar really in my new up and coming book, The Intuitive Self, because it helps us kind of bring things together as to how people experience, well, being alive, but experience reality. So the external environment and their internal environment, their internal models and external models, which runs through these sensory areas and how they're connected, which is what we're going to explore later when we get into the technicals. But really, it's about it's not just perception, right? It's really the basis of experience. So to kind of build the case, first we need to clarify what encoding is. Because encoding isn't just memory storage, right? Or how things are stored. It is really how the brain processes, interprets, stores, connects, synthesizes, and expresses information. And that is really the key, what is it, definition, really, like if you think about it, that I'm trying to bring to people, which is kind of like it. I think in certain ways it's very self-evident that people experience things differently, and there's a lot of reasons for that we're going to explore. Some of them, again, I don't want to make every video the absolute or exhaustive resource for this, because then why would you read my book? But regardless, it's still important to delve into these levels. But the point that I was trying to make, or was about to make, is that we have an intuitive sense that people have different experiences. We don't always maybe necessarily know why that is the case, right? When we're both experiencing, or rather we're both in the situation, the same ontonormative reality, right? Meaning just like that we're in the same space, the same environment, and you have a different experience per person, right? Even when there's an overlap, but we kind of get that, like, okay, you're experiencing something different than I am. And this is very obvious when it comes to tastes in music and the things that you like in terms of smells, the olfactory perception, and then everything really runs through the same idea, right? That every person kind of has their own, not just spectrum, but what is it, defined experiences of what they enjoy and what they don't enjoy, right? So what is in the nervous system approach and avoid, or salient and or uninteresting, or what you find disgusting and what you find attractive, or repulsive and attractive, right? So this is the premise of that the encoding is a major part of that entire experience, effectively. So I'm going to leave it at that for this section, and then in the next section we're going to go explore parts of how this comes to be. Before we really get into what would be the science around it, or the neuroscience in terms of the structures, wiring, and so forth, I wanted to give my conceptualization, right? So how did I come up with this? So first of all, I experience these things, so I try to figure out how it works. So that's obviously the observational, experiential, contemplative element to it. Then there's a book called Frames of Mind. It's by a author, I think it's William Gardner. If I get this correctly, I'll put it up on screen, which effectively talks about multiple intelligences. Now, that theory, or that concept, has certain limitations, though where it excels, in my opinion, is as an addition, or an how do you call that? Like a complementary facet of how encoding profiles work. So if you have different brain areas, right, that deal with visual, spatial, the motor cortex for the kinesthetic stuff, the verbal structure, the obviously auditory systems, right? So all of these different areas kind of have their own intelligences, so to say. So in the multiple intelligences theory, or concept, you have linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, musical, bodily, and kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. So these I effectively added to how encoding works, as you have, for effectively like each segment, and then of course, like, to complexify a more hyperconnectivity between these. But let's just, stick to a more simplified example, that if you have a very well developed auditory cortex, or the auditory part of where this is located in the brain, then your ability to encode, effectively auditory cues and how you experience them is also heightened. And you can make the same case for all of these other facets, right? Especially like if we use, and I use this example a lot, the visual system or the visual spatial system. And I'll explain to you why the spatial element is actually quite important in this. It actually paves the way for an experience that they call hyperphantasia. Hyperphantasia effectively being the ability to conjure up images in your mind, basically on will. So I have this, which means that when I read something, I see images. When somebody tells me a story, I visualize it. It just happens naturally. It can be, it's a double-edged blade in many ways, but it's a strength in certain senses. What I'm trying to, get to is that when you also have a very developed spatial aspect of this, then for people like me and people that also have that in their hyperphantasia, they can rotate shapes, they can, move that in space and time. They can move themselves through space and time. This is how I sometimes map routes. Like I just, kind of effectively zoom out, and then, there I am in this little version of me that is taking the route. It's just an example. Like this can have so many different expressions because of this bioindividuality or encoding, differences, and that's amazing, right? So that's one example. In the previous video, I also talked about the emotional landscape to a certain extent, which was the neuroscience of intuition, and that there was a highlight in there about emotion. There's, in this encoding framework, what I call an emotion space. So for me, in a very visceral, experiential sense, emotions also have their own space inside my body, inside my psyche, that I can revisit. Like I know that there's a space that I can enter into, and then I re-experience that. The same thing with memories. Like if they've been very vividly encoded, which happens a lot, very often for me anyway, then I can re-enter that memory as a space with all of the, or a lot of the somatic experiences around it. That is definitely, as far as this, if you want to call it a skill, as far as this skill goes, a very, I want to use the word dangerous, because you can do so many things with that. But when you're, unhappy, or in other types of states that are on the lower end of the spectrum, let's say, then that can be, abused, that skill, so to say, to just be in this space all the time, right? Although like that's not really my proclivity or tendency, so I'm very mindful of the impact that comes with, and that's why I'm very careful to use these things. But just to make the point, that you can have all of these different combinations. Like, let's say somebody's very mathematical and very visual, then they see maybe that their formulas are in different colors, or they see formulas out in the world, right? Or they see formulas in their head. The same thing for people that are, musical and maybe more mathematical, or music and visual. You see where I'm going with this, right? So when we put a lot of these like sensory experiences together, and now we're coming to the crux of what does that, which is essentially how these brain areas are connected. And you see that when you lean towards neurodivergences, then hyperconnectivity is a very typical trait. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be neurodivergent to have this. Doesn't mean that at all. It's just that that's a very typical feature of it. Hyperconnectivity, that is. So essentially, that's one of the points that I really want to emphasize, that it's not just hyperconnectivity. There are other aspects of this that are involved in that, but that is definitely one of the major components, because if these brain areas weren't connected in certain ways, you wouldn't experience these things in the ways that you are. So I think that the connectivity element, the wiring, is probably the most important aspect of this, because if you didn't have the wiring, then how would that brain encoding work in the way that it does for these very specific profiles? So later down the line in this video, I will outline how I structured these profiles, and I just want to preface that now that is also not an absolute or exhaustive conceptualization of them. Like, I made them precise, but I also just wanted to make it functional to the degree that you can map yourself and others with these concepts, and that it's workable, and you can complexify these just kind of like I did now between the brain areas and sensory capacities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make it very complicated or more complex. So in a way, I like to say that my profiles, the one I conceptualize, are a functional reduction, because we're dealing with so much complexity that I don't want to make a significant profile for everything, or a specific one rather. You can, in the first instance, I believe, reading the book, and then this video is first, right? So if you go through this video, then at least you will have what I think is a very robust concept or model to work with for yourself and perhaps for others. But mainly that from there on out, you can kind of use that or leverage it or lean into it and have a good explanation for why these things are happening, and then you can do with it whatever you want. And that also relates to the practices that I put into the book, because not every encoder responds to the same thing. To just make this case already, somebody that doesn't have a very strong visual encoding experience, right, like leaning towards hyperphantasia or full-blown hyperphantasia, they are not very good with imaginal drills. So if you tell them, imagine this or build this internal space, like a realm or a story, whatever, right? It could be even more reductionist, like imagine a boat. They just don't do this well, which means that there's, always two cases to be made. The first one being that maybe if they want to develop that skill, then you run them through the process of doing so. But there's other people that don't want to invest in learning this skill, and they need to, do whatever they need to do right now. Then maybe they are much better at the linguistic or verbal sense, or maybe they need to write things, right? So instead of imagining things, they run through these drills better in a written form. And that already separates encoding styles, because very often, and this is my great frustration, which is also partly why I'm making this video, advice is given without much consideration of this, right? When we talk about visualization, and I will get into that later to a certain extent, then they just kind of off the bat assume that everyone has the same visualization capabilities, and we know that they don't, right? There's a term called aphantasia, which literally means like the inability to make mental imagery. So how is someone supposed to visualize something when they, from the brain structure wiring premise, can't even do that? That makes no sense. So in order for me to help my clients better and to just coach people better and provide what I believe is a better outline, a better concept, better, like, not better practices necessarily, but steer people towards the right practices. So the filtering and the matching, let's say, then this was a very important piece for me, or concept. As such, right, as the mechanism goes, I strongly feel that this is a very convenient way to navigate things, right? It kind of serves as a compass in that way. And that's how I hope and presume that people approach this concept as. Since I've talked about these different encoding styles, if you want to call it like that, that also gives us an insight into how memory is stored in this way. Again, this is not absolute or exhaustive. The entire, I'm hesitant to use the word, just way of the field of memory. It's not a way, it's a field of memory and a way of memory storage. Like it's pretty expansive. Even the immune system has memory. Like that can mean a lot of things, is what I'm trying to say. It's a very expansive view, right? We're working in a limited scope of memory that has to do with encoding. And that means that different encoders also store memories in a different encoding profile and style. Somebody that is, again, like, to just kind of like give examples in this way, somebody that's very strong in the auditory level, maybe their gravitation is going to also be memories that are strongly, auditory based or related, right? Like they can pinpoint music and when they heard that, and that causes presumably a cascade of associated memories, right, that come emerge to the surface or are tied to it, which is what an associative or an association is anyway in this way. And for some profiles, again, like maybe it's predominantly the hyper-connected ones, they have a lot more of these associative traits in this way. But we could say the same thing for the verbal profile, a mathematical profile, whatever type of profile. These aren't really profiles. So let's just call them styles. Otherwise, like, things will get confusing. I've made that encoding profiles that are coming later that I'm going to highlight. Now we're just really trying to give a little bit more depth and breadth to the idea of how different people experience memories in a different way depending on the encoding style that they have, and also the profile, right, which we'll go into later. But this is just a facet of that maybe the memory association and the things that trigger memories are, can be dominant according to their dominant encoding wiring, right? As we said, when it comes to the sensory areas that are involved in this. And again, I already gave, like some connections or some relationships of these types of examples, which can emerge from that. Which also complexifies this a little bit, because we also know that depending on your encoding profile, and I will go into this in terms when it comes to like higher fidelity encoders, especially when there's more connectivity between their encoded styles in terms of sensory input, then obviously a song can trigger a set of memories. A smell will, like a word can do that. An image will do that, right? A type of somatic sensation can do that. And then you're really entering a realm of the axis and the scope of memory also being related to the neural architecture, right? The more complex the neural architecture is, and that also means that, and the dimensions in terms of dendrite branching, and like we saw a little bit of that in one of the pictures, the more complex their memory storage is in terms of its associative styles and like sensory inputs, which is also fascinating. At least I think it's fascinating because it means that memory is so much more dynamic in so many more ways, again, depending on the profile, but then is generally, let's say, assumed or just kind of perpetuated, right? I think that's the term, or like the gist where I was going with this, that a lot of talk around memory is, outside of the fact that it's pretty basic, it hardly ever seems to orient towards these encoding styles in this way. I mean, I've had so many dialogues, obviously, with clients about this, with friends, with people that share these types of interests, and very often, like, especially when it's podcasts and maybe even books to a certain extent, but it hardly ever seems to convey or explore this type of multifaceted memory. I don't know what to call it. Not just memory storage, memory experience, right? That's the real thing. Which for different encoding profiles will be different. And I think that that's just a very good segue into the encoding profiles themselves. And then, like during their explanations, or their explanation rather, then I can highlight some of the memory aspects in there as well. And because I already used the term experience, right? Because it's really not only about the memory experience. That is one part of it. It's about the entire experience of everything that happens external and internal, right? That's also what these encoding profiles deal with, which is why we're going to explore these now in the next section. That leads us to the encoding profiles. And I'm going to start my way from the least vivid ones into the most vivid ones. That's the structure that I've built. Again, this is my conceptualization of encoding profiles. To what degree they're, I don't know, like accepted in the scientific community, I don't know. They're my conceptualization based on everything that I've read and have been reading and have experienced, observed, and contemplated, reflected on, and then a part of why I'm writing this book in the first place. Especially as it relates to intuition, emotion, and the interoception, or your interoception. So since we talked about the way encoding happens, and I already gave some indications that you have people that can't generate visual imagery, you have people across the board that I call low fidelity encoders, which effectively experience very little of these aspects that we've been talking about. That there's a complexification, because it's hard to say to which degree, in terms of to which degree that somebody. I mean, it's not that hard to say in terms of the fidelity. That's less the issue. The issue is more about if one style of encoding is more dominant than the other, to what degree do they experience fidelity in that way? And that is the more difficult part. So what I'm trying to say here is that effectively it really just depends on many of these facets that we're looking at here, because it's difficult to make a summary around like, oh yeah, this is just how everyone works, because it's not. And what I'm trying to say with that is, just because somebody doesn't encode visually very vividly, that doesn't necessitate, or that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't encode in a auditory way in high fidelity. So that's for the later profiles, but I just wanted to get this out of the way now, because effectively, to me, right, you have a bell curve with these profiles, a bell curve distribution, right? Meaning that on one end of the spectrum, which is the spectrum that we're going to talk about now, they have very low fidelity encoding, right? And this is the part where we're at now, or the part of the bell curve that we're exploring. So for them, as for the way, especially in contrast, right, from the things that I've read and the things that you hear in terms of aphantasia and other, that they can't that they don't have this like vivid memory recall. They don't really get triggered by noise or like music that much, or other types of sensory inputs. That's why it's called like hyposalience, right? Hypo meaning under or below, which means that to them, typically and generally, it makes reality and their internal experiences bland or like flat, 2D, like we would say, like muted, maybe even colorless. And hence, the term hyposalience, because salience means what stands out, and hypo means what, as I said, below or under. So it doesn't make a lot of these things stand out, hence the term that I use, like 2D. So they're under that baseline. They also, again, from what I can see, have a lower perturbation complexity index score, meaning that just, straight out or straight up, that their brains are less complex. And that is both in dimensions, right, into how much this branching has occurred, and in its interconnectedness. And that's why, like, they typically have more of a reduced emotional landscape, and their experiences are more instinctive, or it's like broad stroke, right? They don't have this like granularity when it comes to their emotions and their interoception. Like they still feel the big things like anger, frustration, like sadness, etc. So I'm not saying that they don't feel. It's just that it's more rudimentary feeling. And it's typically, aligned with the hypothalamic drives, right? Desire, aggression, feeding, lust. Like these are all things that are very rudimentary, primal, and instinctual for any organism in this sense, right? And which is I also said that they're like interoceptive spectrum in terms of granularity and sensitivity is reduced. And there's a concept called thick and thin boundaries. Thick boundaries being like things are very compartmentalized and segmented between these experiences and the way they experience themselves, the world, these emotions, comparatively to someone that has thin boundaries, which as the encoding profiles develop, you're going to see that the boundaries between all of these experiences and the way they sense things and feel things become much thinner and more porous. This lands us in the latent capacity encoder, the tier 1 encoder. And I've already kind of foreshadowed this, meaning that if you have people that, let's say full stop, they don't have that capacity at all, right, to whatever degree this is, then you have a large part, like as a segment, a population segment, that has latent capacities that they typically just don't know about. For whatever reason, or actually whatever host of reasons, right, it's very difficult to say, that these just have gone under the radar, these capacities, or never been stimulated, never been trained, never been, explored, any of these or all of these at once, right? That means that these people have the capacity for experiencing a higher fidelity level of encoding. And that, again, that might be whatever they're wired for. But then, again, due to circumstances, environment, childhood, whatever, they haven't developed these latent capacities. So they're typically able to tap into some of their encoding abilities if they do consistent, dedicated, and sometimes hard work. And they do tend to exhibit a more defined emotional landscape and these interoceptive abilities that go with it, especially if you contrast them with a tier 0 low fidelity encoder, right? So we could probably argue that their interoception isn't that extensive or that sensitive. It's probably more muted and is more difficult for them to tap into. And I've had this with clients, trust me. Like some people, their interoceptive capabilities, meaning that the internal perception of their biofeedback signals is just not great. Like if you can put them on certain substances or whatever, do with them whatever you want, and typically they can't give you a very detailed description of these somatic and sensory experiences, which I typically find frustrating, but that's just me, right? Because of my own encoding profile. So that also means that if for the premise of the book, they also have a more rudimentary experience of intuition, right? For them, it's not that profound, it's not that frequent, it's just not that big of a thing for them. Maybe the low fidelity encoder barely experiences that at all, right? At least this profile has it. It's just not very dominant nor profound, and the frequency is typically low. So in terms of the concept of thin and thick boundaries, they obviously gravitate towards thicker boundaries, which can buffer aspects of reality, or it does, right? They just have these stronger segmentations between certain both experiences internally and experiences that they have externally. In the next profile, or this profile, this is where things get more interesting, at least for me, or at least in terms of the fidelity of the encoding experience. So the tier 2, the functional embodied encoder, it kind of gives it away in the title, right? And if we looked at the bell curve, I put it on screen in the original segment in the tier 0 encoding explanation, that we can revisit it here, right? They're on the further end of the right side of the spectrum. So these people tend to experience things more vividly, right? Hence higher fidelity and strongly. And they thus have access to high fidelity or higher fidelity experiences. They're often more receptive and sensitive to sensory stimuli, and this is again due to this receptivity and sensitivity. They also have a more defined emotional landscape, so that means that they have more granularity, right? More precision, more definition, more scope. It's broader. It has more elements. They can differentiate better. Which also sets the stage for better or higher interoceptive abilities and a stronger connection to their intuition. That also means that they have a more of a nuanced hedonic valence, which means that they, in terms of salience, right, they can have an easier time navigating their likes and dislikes, far easier, right, especially compared to tier 0 and tier 1. And that also means that they experience a higher degree of the hedonic gradient or spectrum, although all the things that there are in the world and inside of them, right, internally, that they have a much better, a much more developed spectrum. That's what I meant to say. So that also means that as a profile, they typically seek out more of these enriching experiences, seek awe and wonder in kind of whatever expression or facet that comes in, and have a higher tendency to want to be immersed in beauty and aesthetics, right? So this profile, to this profile, immersion like this, right, this embeddedness into these different aspects is like spiritual nutrition, and they have a higher likelihood of having this drive to create or express their experiences creatively. And that's exactly due to that capacity, right? So if they have the significant ability to simulate the experiences of others, that also means that they have, more developed empathy circuits that foster a more accurate theory of mind, but also tends to have a different processing style that creates a tendency for them wanting to express these experiences. This kind of already leads us into memory, right? Because if things are so much more vivid for you, and you experience so much more of this, and you have these creative aspects, then we're starting to see that the way they extort memories, which is how encoding, it's a part of it, right? How encoding works, and their associative encoding style and profile with this is completely different than the other ones. So for them, their memories are more contextual, they're more nuanced, they have more fidelity. This fidelity can be expressed in whatever aspect of encoding style that they have, in terms of like if it's musical, if it's mathematical, whatever. They're far more likely to remember something that has a salience to them. These are going into hypersalience, right? What stands out to them? If they're really into music, then their ability to recall musical things is going to be much, much higher, right? And that's when that's why we're talking about fidelity and using that as a concept, not just in the way that it relates to experience, but definitely obviously in the way it relates to encoding, but also encoding from a memory aspect, right? This is where those facets and abilities really come to shine. So now we come to the tier 3 high fidelity encoder. And as you can assume, right, if we start with the concept of the thin boundaries, this is where the boundaries are the thinnest. That also means that for them, reality is very dense and very rich. And that also has to do with their perturbation complexity index. They have a very high perturbation complexity index. So their brain is very complex, that means that they have both high dimensionality, right, in terms of layers of branching, and high hyperconnectiveness in the brain, which makes them, right, highly sensitive and receptive. Everything is more porous in this way and dynamic. This is a hypersalience, right? So the experience of hypersalience to them can be overstimulating, because obviously like having to process this much is demanding, right, in terms of energy and resources for the brain. And their experience of modeling is very close to the experiencing the simulation, meaning that a simulation for them, quote unquote, in their mind is so much more than just a cognitive simulation. It's a complete somatic experience, or at least it can be like that. They don't meaning that if they go back into a memory, they experience a lot of that again. It's not just that's something that's far away. Everything comes back with it, right? And that again is an indication of just how thin and porous these boundaries are between their experiences of memory and encoding in general, right? So that also means that they have incredible, nuanced, and detailed emotional landscapes that house many paradoxes and even potential internal storms, right? Because there's so much happening inside of them, and they typically are high fidelity encoders, which also means that they tend to store more things, right? Because the salience tag of hey, this is important, we need to focus on that or attach some value to it, you will have far more of that, right? Especially when reality is as versatile, rich, and dense as it is to them. That also typically means that their interoception is more of a hair trigger. So it's a finely tuned instrument that allows them to navigate these internal experiences with exceptional lucidity, right? So that also, as I kind of pointed out before, that their ability to simulate and map others is of a very high degree. Some people have, told me, or other people like me, that were mind readers, right? You're just so locked in and tapped into a person with all of these capacities that, and then there's other aspects of this that are more neurobiological, and then in terms of the interpersonal, interpersonal synchrony, which is shared neural coupling, meaning your brainwaves sync up and stuff like that, right? Which, if you have thin boundaries and you have all of these interoceptive and other perceptive capabilities, then all of these modeling aspects can be very vivid and strong, right? Because of all of this high fidelity. So that also means that they have a much richer theory of mind, right? Which is clear in this way. So, and another aspect of this is that their hedonic valence and gradient are a profound navigational instrument for their life, since they exhibit high intuitive knowing rather, by tapping into these layers that are, seen as otherworldly or metaphysical, at least by others, right? So for them, like, these boundaries are so thin that distinguishing between certain levels can get difficult. And for instance, that they might have a hard time in certain states to distinguish dreams, fantasies, and visions and simulations from reality, right? And that's a profile, for instance, that doesn't need psychedelics and that is very sensitive to any type of compound you expose them to. And I mean, technically, they're sensitive to whatever you expose them to. And seeing that they're high fidelity encoders, their memory is also so vivid. Like, I can tell you that for me personally, like, a lot of my dreams I remember from decades ago. I remember them with astounding clarity. I've said in the previous one of the previous segments about memory that if you couple that to a visual spatial dominance or a very well developed visual spatial part of the cortex, then to me these experiences of memory, or the memory itself and the emotions that come with it, form a space. So the memory is a space somewhere in my meta-organism or organism that I can re-enter into. As I said before, that's not something that I play around with very often because, obvious reasons. But I'm just saying that so many of these things have been stored, and I know this because I can tap into it, depending on how good my state is, essentially by will. So I don't need external prompts or triggers. I can just, remember a lot of different things and go, I kind of want to relive that again. I mean, typically I don't. I like to make new memories, but I am aware of the double-edged blade where it's like, whether the memory is pleasant or unpleasant or even meh, I know that a lot of these things I'm going to store and remember anyway. So for somebody within boundaries, it's, kind of part of the quote-unquote survival kit to be very what's the word for discerned, or have a lot of discernment into what you're being exposed to, which is also kind of ironic that these people like me, or people high fidelity encoders in this way, also tend to gravitate towards high openness, meaning that they want to experience a lot of different things, right? So this profile is very sticky in this way, right? With everything kind of hanging around in your subconscious for a very long time. And that these boundaries are so thin that it's difficult to observe and not, absorb, which is just a part of this profile. And you learn how to navigate it, which is going to be part of the book. I'm not going to highlight any practices in this way right now. And it's also to say, or to add, that for profiles like mine, it's very important to have grounding practices, right, that kind of like thicken the boundaries, so to say, so that they don't, fly off into whatever imaginal or imaginative fantasy spheres or whatever that can emerge from them, right? Like their ability, or my ability in this case, to visualize timelines or probable futures, or just things that I'd like to do. It's astounding, right? It's almost like I'm living it, which is why I said that I need to focus on certain activities or social scenes where they ground me in the present, that I get my feet literally back on the ground touching grass, so I can stay anchored into the present rather than veering off into the future or the past, right? Or into whatever imaginary landscape that I have access to or design. So that kind of concludes this exploration of encoding profiles, and that gives you a navigational tool. And I hope it was insightful. So if it was, then a like and subscribe, and maybe comment where you are on the spectrum, or how encoding works for you. As I said, like, this is supposed to be like a functional reduction in a certain sense, even when it has some precision. I mean, I think it does, right? And accounts for a lot of it. It doesn't account for everything. That's why I'm asking for people like to comment or engage with the content, so I also get to know and see how many variations there are between these styles and profiles, and what stands out for you, or how you experience things, or associative memory, links or structures, like all of this stuff I find very fascinating. So if you want to share, then please do share in the comment section, and I would love to read it. So that concludes this video. I will, link the usual stuff below and then in the description section. And if you want to read more of my work, will be able to find it there. So thank you for watching.